So, namaskar, friends, once again, and thanks for joining. In this lecture, continuing our discussion that helps us situate diaspora and diasporic subject in proper perspective. Uh, in the previous classes, we talked about the theoretical formulations that helped us in proper understanding of the broader concept of diaspora and all its allied concerns like identity, home, belonging, culture, etc. Now, taking it forward, I intend to talk about some more such concepts that will help us understand the diasporic intricacies. So, in this particular lecture, I am going to talk about double consciousness, cultural mapping, and contrapuntal reading, and all these concepts put together will further help us understand this process of diaspora. So, double consciousness is a very important concept which was introduced by W.E.B. Du Bois in his influential 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk. And it's a powerful idea that explores the internal conflict experienced by African Americans due to their dual identity, both as blacks and Americans, in a society that is dominated by white values and white norms. So, at its core, double consciousness refers to the sense of looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist society and feeling a split in identity. As Dubois himself says, this sense of always looking at one's self through the eyes of others, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. So, this two-ness leads to a constant struggle, and so this keeps on tormenting these people, and because they always feel some kind of split within themselves, and they have the dual roles to play. First of all, they have to reconcile to their situation, which calls for a black identity with broader American identity, and it often excludes or devalues blackness because the American society is predominantly white. Another problem this leads to is to be fully American while knowing well that this society does not always grant black individuals full acceptance or equality. So, we find that this idea of double consciousness talks about especially the black subjects who are torn by internal conflict, and they are constantly navigating between two different identities, who they feel they are, and how society looks at them. Another thing, it also leads to a sense of alienation because they don't feel they are belonging to any of the groups fully. The group to which they naturally belong to is not their dominant disposition because of the prevailing circumstances, and what they try to show they are is not accepted by the society at large because they are marginalized, being blacks in a predominantly white country. This also leads to resistance and insight, which is the positive aspect of this double consciousness, as Dubois would point out, because the people who are experiencing double consciousness often see America more clearly because they understand both the ideals and inequalities. So, in fact, they are the people who can really tell you the true story. And so that's why this double consciousness is very, very important in discussions like identity, race, marginalization, and intersectionality. And we continue to find its representation in media, in education, in other fields as well, like modern black representation in film, TV, and social media often walks a fine line between authenticity and expectation, and it plays out in the form of, let's say, stereotyping versus authenticity. Black creators and actors may feel pressurized to portray characters in a way that appeals to white audiences or reinforces familiar tropes, even if it misrepresents the real black experiences. Likewise, there is need on their part for code switching. So, in public media appearances or professional roles, many black individuals adjust how they speak or present themselves to seem palatable to individuals or audiences belonging to mainstream, often white dominated group. But representation really matters. The rise of the shows like Insecure, Atlanta, or Black Panther, um, which are coming up now, are challenging this single dimensional portrayals, and are offering more nuanced self defined representations of black identity. In education, again, this double consciousness is perceived as curriculum gaps. Like most of the curriculums in schools are either white centric or Eurocentric, and have little inclusion of the black perspective. And as a result, the black children have to read something which they don't relate to. And in fact, it is uh, kind of acting white stigma that is attached to them. So, knowing that they are not whites and they don't relate to whatever they study, they still have a compulsion to pretend that they understand everything and they relate to everything. They also have to navigate bias in education, because often we find that blacks are stereotyped even by teachers, and so they are not given the same kind of attention and respect as their white counterparts do. Especially in mental health services, this uh, double consciousness works in the sense there is always a sense of chronic vigilance when the blacks realize that they are being constantly observed, watched, and uh, critiqued. And that's why they have to subscribe to the majority or the superior view, and that puts extra stress on them, and leads to mental breakdown, leads to anxiety, leads to distress. And so this also leads to emotional fatigue and leads to mental health issues. There are therapy gaps as well, because the mental health services often lack the cultural competence to deal with the black subjects, and the black individuals are frequently misunderstood by therapists who don't grasp the racial dynamics they face. And that is why the double consciousness, on the one hand, leads to mental health issues. On the other hand, there being different poses challenges for the therapists while dealing with their problems. Uh, so they try healing themselves through their culture and their cultural practices. So, this double consciousness is important in the sense we might talk about an idealized world where, such discriminations have of late ceased, but then at the subtle level we still find that this is very much present. And but people are much more aware now. And if we talk about the black people, we can say that they are finding new ways to resist, reclaim, and redefine their identities on their own terms. So uh, double consciousness is about navigating multiple realities, but also uh, pushing back against the need to split in the first place. And we find that the diasporic people also suffer this double consciousness because they are torn between what they have been taught at home and what they are expected to perform in the new place. But then this also provides them better perspective to look at them and to make themselves resilient and also little what we can call fluid or flexible or adaptable in order to survive. So this concept is really important for us. And this term is derived from European romanticism and American transcendentalism. We all know about Ralph Waldo Emerson as one of the greatest transcendentalist American poets. So he wrote the worst feature of this double consciousness is that the two lives of the understanding and of the soul which he leads really so very little relation to each other. One prevails now, all buzz and dean; the other prevails then, all infinitude and paradise. And with the progress of life, the two discover no greater disposition to reconcile themselves. So, wittily, he also underlines this point of irreconcilability when you carry this kind of double consciousness. Dubois quotes, "One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, unreconciled strivings." And so he uses the metaphor of whale to describe how black people see themselves through the distorted lens of white society. And this whale represents both separation or social exclusion and awareness, a unique insight into race relations. He further argues that this double consciousness prevents black people from developing a unified, independent sense of self. Why? Because if they reject white norms, they risk social and economic exclusion, and if they conform, they suppress their cultural heritage and individuality. So, in a way, this is a double edged sword and a tightrope, we can say, on which these people have to walk. Um, in literature, if I was to quote an example, we can talk about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. The unnamed protagonist struggles with complex individuality, the refusal of white society to recognize his existence beyond racial stereotypes. In Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, Piccola Breedlove, a black girl, internalizes white beauty standards and believes that having blue eyes will make her beautiful and accepted, reflecting the damaging effects of racialized self perception. So, obviously, uh, this does not allow the black subjects to have a unified self. The second concept is equally important, and it's important for the diasporic subjects as well as the host countries. This is called cultural mapping, and at its core, this is about understanding and representing the cultural landscape of a place, and it is often used in urban planning, heritage preservation, community development, education, and the arts. It includes both tangible and intangible heritages. Intangible heritages, it talks about historic sites, museums, galleries, festivals, public art, theaters. In intangible, it talks about oral histories, music, dances, uh, culinary traditions, beliefs, rituals, dialects. And in creative economy, it talks about local artists, designers, musicians, cultural businesses, and institutions. And in social and cultural networks, it talks about communities, cultural groups, and the relationships between them. Why this cultural mapping is important? Because it acts for community empowerment. It helps communities see and celebrate their own cultural richness, often leading to a stronger sense of identity and pride. And so, when the diasporic subjects indulge in cultural mapping, this helps them preserve and showcase their culture, and in that case, to feel secured and connected. It also helps in preservation in the sense they document and protect their traditions, especially those that are at the risk of being lost to globalization, migration, or modernization. So we find that uh, the diasporic communities always try to preserve and protect uh, all their rituals and traditions, uh, fearing that if they don't do, they will be lost forever. It also helps them in planning and development, like the host countries also plan and develop according to the understanding of the cultural background of their subjects. So we have seen that even countries like Saudi Arabia have come up with uh, some temples, and this is because of the cultural mapping, because of their understanding uh, of the people who have come to live with them and their cultural demands. It also helps in tourism and economy, because that way you highlight your heritage. And so this cultural mapping is done in several ways, and one of the ways it is done is participatory mapping, in which community members contribute their knowledge through workshops, interviews, or storytelling, and this way they enhance the understanding of their culture. There is GIS based mapping, using digital tools and geographic information systems to plot cultural assets on a map for visual analysis. This is also done through narratives or visual documentation, like through photography, video, drawing, or oral histories. And so, why this cultural mapping is important? On the one hand, the cultural mapping helps the diasporic subjects in particular to identify and take pride in their rich cultural heritage. It also helps them preserve them, um, so that they are not lost, and this also helps them in advocating for indigenous rights. They protect their traditional lands, their traditional practices. They fight for recognition. So we have seen many such movements based on cultural mapping uh, in the foreign countries, where the Indians have fought for reclaiming their rights to practice their religion, to wear their religious emblems, and so on and so forth. And this also helps the refugees and migrant communities in documenting their cultural continuity in new places. And this is how they can connect to their own people, create an enabling environment to grow, and also pass it on to their future generations. It has also helped in art and education, in that the students have been engaged in exploring their cultural surroundings. So, this also helps them know more about their own cultures. So, the purpose has always been to preserve and assert land rights, protect sacred sites, and pass on traditional knowledge to younger generations. And we have many such projects going on at the moment. I can just mention some of them that have indulged in cultural mapping for cultural preservation, and mostly this is needed for the minority communities. So there is one project in Australia which is called Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Mapping, in which the Aboriginal communities are trying to preserve their culture, their cultural practices, and their cultural heritage, so that it is not lost to time. Likewise, in Toronto, Canada, there is another cultural mapping project which is known as My City, My Voice. And there are similar such projects going on in New Orleans, mapping the cultural ecosystem, and so on and so forth. So, this cultural mapping really helps communities in sustaining their cultural practices and maintaining them, and maintaining their continuity for generations. So, cultural products such as literature, film, and music draw from and contribute to cultural meanings of a place, and the mapping of these onto a territory also forms a branch of cultural mapping. So, code developed through a loosely formulated international community of practice consisting of scholars, in community practitioners, and policy governance agencies. For instance, UNESCO, national cultural ministries, local authorities, they all are different dimensions of cultural mapping. So, cultural mapping of diasporic groups helps them in understanding how they can maintain, transform, and negotiate their identities in a new environment while staying connected to their homelands. And as I said, it includes their heritage and traditions like rituals, festivals, languages, cuisine, um, spaces and landscapes like temples, mosques, churches, community centers, ethnic groups, transnational networks like digital communication and cultural exchange, memory and identity like migration, displacement, belonging, adaptation and hybridization, evolution with host cultures. So, if you go to Fiji or Mauritius or to Caribbean islands, you will find that the diasporic communities have preserved their heritage and tradition, have preserved their spaces and landscapes, and have established transnational networks so that they can remain connected to their roots, and at the same time through their stories, through their other means of expression, through their oral narratives, through their media representations, they have perpetuated that experience of displacement, migration, and belonging. And they have also tried to adapt by adopting and combining their native traditions with the host traditions for better survival. So, this cultural mapping is not about knowing oneself, it is also about knowing how to send down one's roots, or how to settle in a culture that is other than one's own, by respecting those cultural traditions also that are different from one's own. Because if you love yourself, probably you will also understand that the others have the same right to love themselves. So, while preserving your own cultural identity, this also helps you connect better to the host cultures, and this has really helped the diasporic communities. The third concept that I would like to talk about is another very important concept, and this term was developed by one of the most important critics. We talked about him earlier, Edward Said, and it is something similar to what Terry Eagleton says, reading against the grain. So we find that reading a text contrapuntally means being aware of the perspectives of both the colonizer and the colonized, and even when one is not explicitly present, as it happens in most of the cases where there is a silencing of the voice of the colonized subject. So it is about seeing how literature that seems to be just about, say, England on or France, often depends on or is shaped by imperial power, colonial labor, or the presence of the other. So earlier also we have seen how Edward Said emphasizes that the Occident without Orient has no meaning. So in a way it should be treated as complementary rather than contradictory. So while a traditional reading, let's say, let's take an example of a 19th century text like Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. A traditional reading might focus on Jane's inner life, gender roles, and class, but a contrapuntal reading might ask, what about Bertha Mason, the Creole woman locked in the attic? Where is the colonial Caribbean in this story? How does her silencing reflect the broader silencing of colonized people? So, when we make a contrapuntal reading, that means we question the perspective from which a representation of a truth or a situation has been made. So, like it reveals the power dynamics embedded in classic literature. Who tells the story and whose story is being told? What truth is valued and what reality is suppressed? So, there is the mutual constitution of empire and culture, and how imperialism shapes even the most domestic or romantic stories. If we read contrapuntally, we will have a different understanding of these texts altogether. The need to include global perspectives, not just Western ones, in interpretation is part of this contrapuntal reading, and this relates to our post colonial project, in which we have seen how the colonial powers, you know, conceived Orient as the exotic other, and this othering or looking at Orient in their own imagination is something that has to be looked at. So, contrapuntal reading is key to post colonial studies, decolonizing curricula, understanding historical complicity in literature and art, how our historical forms, our histories have been deformed or misrepresented, and amplifying silenced voices in dominant cultural narratives. So, contrapuntal reading is like turning up the volume on the background track, the voices, histories, and cultures that mainstream texts often depend on but don't fully acknowledge. It asks you to see the connections between empire and culture and to read with global critical lens. So, if we look at some of the examples, as I said, Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, is another text that can be read contrapuntally and will reveal how British wealth and aristocracy were tied to Caribbean slavery, a fact largely ignored in the novel's surface narrative. Likewise, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you know, which was apparently a critique of the empire, when we read it contrapuntally, it reveals how African characters are silenced and dehumanized, reinforcing colonial stereotypes, uh, you know, which Joseph Conrad apparently uh, likes to negate. Likewise, if we look at one of the popular texts, The Tempest by Shakespeare, will find that read contrapuntally will see both the dominant European colonial narrative and the suppressed voice of the colonized. In that, we find that Prospero is the colonizer, and metaphorically, we look at Prospero as the colonizer and Caliban as the colonized subject, and we find that the colonized subject has its own, history, which has been negated, which has been suppressed, which has been erased. Caliban says, "This island is mine by Sycorax, my mother." And this line asserts indigenous ownership and connection to the land. And all of us know Prospero had to fly from his own place, um, had to flee from his own place because of the machinations of his brother, and in a way is landless, but he lands on this island and takes control of it. So, a contrapuntal reading reveals how Shakespeare stages the tension between native rights and imperial domination. If we think of Caliban as a symbol of all colonized people, uh, we'll find that how all of us as colonized subjects were stripped of land, culture, and voice by the European empires. If we look at this island as a colonized space, we'll find that the island transforms under Prospero's rule from wild to ordered, uh, the civilizational project of the colonizers. And in contrapuntal reading, the island is a metaphor for lands appropriated by colonial powers, its native systems erased or rewritten. So, you can also bring in the global voices, like you can read this particular text, Am Caesar's Une Tempête, a powerful post colonial adaptation where Caliban rejects colonial language and asserts black identity. You can also refer to Franz Fanon, who writes about how colonized people internalize inferiority but also resist and reclaim their identity. You can also refer to Gugiwa Thiong'o, who emphasizes language and cultural reclamation in his Decolonizing the Mind. So, finally, friends, if we talk about contrapuntal reading, it does not reject the tempest, it deepens it, it opens up the text to voices that were always present but silenced, and turns the story from a tale of magical redemption into a reflection on empire, resistance, and voice. And so it turns out to be a revealing text to colonial subjects, where they find that very skillfully and willfully their voices have been silenced under the garb of civilizing by the dominant European discourse. So, friends, these three concepts of double consciousness, cultural mapping, and contrapuntal reading will really help us uh, when we take up the texts by diasporic writers, and will certainly help us look at the characters and the situations in the right perspective. So, for now, thank you very much. In the next class, we continue with some more useful concepts that will further help us understand the whole diasporic phenomenon and the diasporic narratives. Thank you very much.